You're listening to the Speaking Tongues podcast. I'm your host, El Charisse. Each week, I sit down to a conversation with multilinguals where we discuss and celebrate language, life, and culture through our own perspectives. Episode 78, Speaking Mandarin and Russian. Hello, language lovers. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Speaking Tongues, the podcast and conversation with multilinguals. My guest this week is Kevin, who joined me to talk about two of his many languages, Mandarin and Russian. In this episode, Kevin talks about moving back to Shanghai as a kid and having to catch up to the language, even as someone who had regularly heard and spoke Mandarin at home. We talk about the languages and dialects of Mandarin and areas where they're spoken in China. Kevin talks about Shanghainese speakers and how this specific language is used and where we would most likely hear it in Shanghai. We talk about code switching between Mandarin and Shanghainese and some of the differences in tonality among Mandarin. We take a deep diversion into the Chinatown communities in New York City and talk about some of the Chinese languages you're likely to hear in each of them. Kevin also talks to us about studying Russian and his experience of being immersed in Russian culture during his time abroad. Big thank you to Kevin for sharing parts of your language journey with us. If you enjoyed this episode of Speaking Tongues, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the Speaking Tongues podcast on Apple Podcasts, or like and subscribe on YouTube so that other language lovers like ourselves can find the show. And if you've been a longtime listener of the show or even a recent listener, you can now support the show on buymeacoffee.com. Links to all platforms are in the show notes. Okay, let's chat. Welcome back to another episode of Speaking Tongues. I'm here today with Kevin. How are you today, Kevin?
Hi, I'm good. Doing well.
I'm so happy to have you here and have an opportunity to talk about your languages. I like to start each episode with the same question, and that is, what is your first language and which languages have you learned to speak?
Right. So as far as first language goes, I guess it's a tie between English and Mandarin. I was born here in the States, but moved back to China as a kid. So finished high school in a Mandarin-speaking school. And yeah, I'd say both of them are my first. I mean, nowadays, living in New York on a day-to-day basis, I use quite a bit more English. So maybe, yeah, English has edged ahead a bit. But yeah, English and Chinese are my first languages. And then the foreign language that I've studied the most in depth would be Russian, which I took for 2 years in college, and then lived in Russia for a summer, continued studying it on and off, used Russian as a medium for studying other languages as well. Mm-hmm. After that, I'd say the language I practice the most regularly living in New York might be Spanish. And then, I don't know, there's a long list after that, but yeah, French, Portuguese, German, Serbo-Croatian, Hindi. Lately, I've been doing a good amount of Korean, Japanese I've studied, Turkish, Arabic, Hebrew. Yeah, I guess that those are the main ones that I actually conversational, and there's like several others I've studied on and off.
That's definitely a long list. How did that happen? How did you get to all of these different languages? What sparked your interest in wanting to communicate in all of these?
Well, I guess it started when my family moved back to Shanghai when I was 10 years old. And I mean, first of all, I had to sort of catch up on Chinese a bit, since I like the dynamic with languages in our family before we went back to China was that my parents would speak to me in Mandarin or in Shanghainese, but I would just respond in English. So I sort of needed to catch up on Mandarin, first of all, when we went back to China. But like that took like maybe a semester, I guess. And I mean, that was sort of a picking up a new language,
Mm-hmm.
immersed there, that environment. But after that, what really helped was that everyone else, all my classmates, still had to take English class, and I was exempt as a native speaker. So yeah, while everyone else in school was still taking English, I started yeah, getting a bit interested in various other languages. Um, got like a French textbook from a local bookstore, Japanese, started on Arabic, didn't really get far, started on Russian just on my own. Yeah, although I guess, yeah, as a as a high schooler living in Shanghai in the 2000s, there weren't really that many opportunities to practice these languages like actively. So it was mostly just like reading books and going on the internet a bit. I mean, I feel like it's become much easier to learn foreign languages on your own nowadays than it was like when I was in high school.
Yeah.
But anyways, that's when I started getting interested. So once I came back to New York for college, um, I ended up going with Russian for, I was a linguistics major, and one of the requirements for that is you take a foreign language and it can't be a Western European language or like your native language. I guess they
Oh,
consider, I
okay.
don't know, I guess they consider, I don't know, French and Spanish a bit too, I don't know, easy is the right word, but
Easy.
just too similar, just like not different enough from English for the purposes of like getting like a broader sense of the variety of languages in the
Right.
world, I suppose. Um, yeah, so did that for 2 years. After living in Russia for a summer, like I'd say that was like the first language I really got to like an advanced level at
Mm-hmm.
from studying, and that sort of helped a lot just with in terms of like confidence and just like having done it once, it feels like it's easier to learn more languages afterwards, especially with a language like Russian, where the grammar is pretty messy and like complicated, and it
Yeah.
sort of makes you think about how the parts of a sentence fit together and stuff like that. So after that, I sort of revisited Spanish and French and started adding on other ones like Persian. And after 2 years of Russian, I also took a year of Uzbek in college. I can't really actively speak it anymore, but
Mm-hmm.
still understand quite a bit when I listen.
Take me back for a second because you said that when
Mm-hmm.
you were growing up with your, in your home with your parents,
Yeah.
and your
Mm-hmm.
parents spoke Shanghainese. So
Yep.
what is Shanghainese? Is that like is it a dialect? Is it what is it?
Right. I mean, people generally call it a dialect. I mean, but it's like from a linguistic point of view, it would not, it's definitely not a dialect of Mandarin. Like it's more different from Mandarin, or at least as different from Mandarin as I'd say Portuguese is from Spanish, probably
Okay.
slightly more so. But just, yeah, just culturally and I guess politically within China, it's generally like people talk about even Cantonese, or Hokkien or Hakka or whatever, all of those languages as being dialects of Chinese, because the written language is generally the same. Like no one really writes books in anything other than Mandarin. So Shanghainese is part of, there are basically like 7 or 8 major so-called dialect groups of Chinese. Mandarin is the biggest one. I just
Mm-hmm.
checked on Wikipedia half an hour ago. It looks like 70% of all Chinese speakers are native speakers of some variety of Mandarin. And then it's Cantonese, and then it's Wu, which is spoken sort of in the Yangtze River Delta region, which is where Shanghai is.
Okay.
So Shanghai belongs to the Wu, so quote unquote, dialect
Mm-hmm.
family. And it's probably at this point the most representative dialect slash language within the Wu group, just because it's the biggest city in the region.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's really cool. So if you when you had to, I guess when you moved back to Shanghai, or when you moved to Shanghai when you were a kid and you were catching up, what
Mm-hmm.
kind of issues did you have between Shanghainese and Mandarin, and I guess being in school and making new friends? Like how was it to communicate between those two?
Well, in Shanghai in school, basically everyone is supposed to, at least in theory, just speak Mandarin all the time. It's like there's rules against speaking dialect in school. At least there were at the time. I think the policy has changed a bit since then. But yeah, when I was in school, like kids would sometimes speak Shanghainese to each other uh, during breaks between classes, but everything else was all the instruction was in Mandarin, all the news and announcements and everything was in Mandarin. So it's not quite like, for example, the situation you'd see in Hong Kong, where literally like everything is just in Cantonese, even in official situations. In Shanghai and like in most of the mainland, everyone knows Mandarin, and you
Right.
would just speak. So if I spoke Mandarin, yeah, everyone would understand me. And
Mm-hmm.
generally, especially later on in middle school, high school, we would always have like a few like students from out of town in our class, because like a lot of people, their parents would move to Shanghai and send their kids to a local school, and a lot of these kids didn't speak Shanghainese at all. So Mandarin was the main language of school. I guess the
Okay.
one place where Shanghainese was a bit of a barrier sometimes was with like family gatherings. Like a lot of older people in Shanghai just like they understand Mandarin but can't speak it. And so like when we would go visit our grandparents or something, it would be like me and my brother would just speak to them in Mandarin and they'd respond in Shanghainese, and we could sort of we'd understand each other, but it was just sort of a different dynamic there.
Okay.
Yeah, and I guess another thing is just that because like there's no official like no one studies Shanghainese in a classroom and actually learns like from a book the correct pronunciation of Shanghainese words. My pronunciation of Shanghainese was always a bit off. There were like various issues with sometimes like you can, if you know the Mandarin pronunciation, you can guess what it probably sounds like in Shanghainese, but that's like
Mm-hmm.
really not very reliable. So I would just like not really speak Shanghainese very much myself because like my pronunciation was like not great. Mm-hmm.
What do you think, or when you talk about older family members, elders in your
Mm-hmm.
family not communicating in Mandarin, is that
Mm-hmm.
typical of that generation?
I think so. Yeah, because I mean, a lot of these people, I mean, they went to school like before the founding of the People's Republic in '49, and so yeah, everyone like even like I've seen some like old videos from like schools in the Republican era in Shanghai. Like yeah, like the teacher would just be teaching kids in Shanghainese, and that would just be like the language of instruction, the language that everyone used to communicate on the street. Um, but I mean, afterwards, sort of during the modernization process after '49, like the authorities decided like the whole country should have one common language, and then
Mm-hmm.
Mandarin started being taught more in schools after that. Mm-hmm.
I
So yeah, older people
see.
just didn't learn it.
In a place like Shanghai that
Mm-hmm.
I imagine people from all over the world are living in this in this
Mm-hmm.
metropolis.
Yeah.
What languages, Chinese or otherwise, are commonly heard?
So yeah, I'd say well, Mandarin is definitely the primary language used for communication in Shanghai. Although one thing that I've noticed like recently, every time I go back to Shanghai and I'm just like going around town with my parents, like when they walk into a shop or like get on a taxi or whatever, they tend to just start the conversation in Shanghainese with like the driver or with like the waiter at the restaurant or whatever, and only switch to Mandarin if like the person responds in Mandarin. Otherwise, like
Oh.
they'll just still do it in Shanghainese. Like, I mean, they grew up in the city. They sort of like, yeah, my parents, I feel like, still mostly speak Shanghainese
Mhm.
to each other, and yeah, so there's still like that level of like people use it like in just sort of casual, like, but if you were like giving a lecture in a school, or like if you're like a news broadcaster, or if you're
Like if you're going to a
yeah,
bank
like
or something or
right,
something
yeah, that sort of
official.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, even then though, I feel like it's sort of a mix. It really depends on like sort of the person, because like there are a lot of people not from Shanghai who have moved to the city
Mm-hmm.
recently who don't necessarily speak Shanghainese that well.
Does any type of, or maybe if you're aware of it, does any type of code switching happen between the Mandarin and Shanghainese?
Yeah, I feel like among my classmates in school, it was kind of common for people to sort of like, even one thing I think that actually happens pretty commonly is people will be speaking in Shanghainese, and then they have to say like some like sort of word that's really only used in official context or something.
Mm,
Then they're like, oh, I'm not actually entirely sure how to say that in Shanghainese, and they switch to using like the more, they just switch and say it in Mandarin because
right.
they don't actually know what it is in Shanghainese
Okay.
sometimes. Mm-hmm.
As far as Mandarin goes,
Yep.
what are some things that make Mandarin stand out from some of the other languages and dialects spoken in China?
Right. So I guess the main distinguishing factor, and I guess before I get into that, just to there's when we say Mandarin, I guess it can refer to two different concepts. One is sort of like standard Mandarin, that is like the official language of like mass media and officialdom in the People's Republic of China, that standard Mandarin. And then there's, more broadly speaking, the Mandarin dialect group, which isn't just like the standard Mandarin is based on the way people speak in Beijing, whereas
Mm,
there are other dialects of Mandarin spoken across the north and also a bit in the west in places like Sichuan, Yunnan, which is like down by the border with Myanmar, and those are considered Mandarin dialects, but
okay.
they're sometimes quite different from standard Mandarin, also known as
Right.
Putonghua in Chinese. But either way, the main difference between Mandarin, or northern dialects in general, and dialects in the rest of the country is they phonetically they're just simpler in a number of ways. First of all, they have like fewer tones. Like Mandarin only has four or arguably five tones, whereas like something like Cantonese has something like 7 or 9 tones, again, depending on how you count them.
Okay.
Um, so, and another thing is also, yeah, that Mandarin dialects don't have, they, Mandarin has gotten rid of the so-called entering tone, which is not really a tone. It's like when we're, like in Mandarin, a word can only end on either a vowel or an N or an NG, like
Hmm.
Wang or Wan or Wa, like only those. Whereas in a lot of dialects, like in Cantonese, for example, you can have words that end with like a K or a P or a T, and those have all just disappeared in Mandarin. So like, for example, like the word for good fortune is like fuk, like F-U-K, it ends on like a K sound. And that sort of, in Mandarin, just fu, like the final K just disappears. So whereas in like Shanghainese, for example, it's sort of like, because Shanghai is like right by sort of the southern edge of where Mandarin is natively spoken. So like the Wu
Mhm.
dialects, they sort of, it's not a K anymore, but it's not completely gone. It's sort of like a glottal stop. So it'd be like foot, like just like that. So in Mandarin, it's just like all these like P and T and K endings have all just disappeared. So it's just like more simplified.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
How interesting. Do you know, and maybe you don't,
Mm-hmm.
and if you don't, it's okay, between these northern dialects of Mandarin and this standard one that I guess
Mm-hmm.
is used in an official capacity,
Yep.
How different are those?
My understanding is that one of the biggest differences is just that the tones are different. Like they're just pronounced with like it'll be rising in standard Mandarin, but maybe falling or level in like the dialect of Shandong or whatever. That's like, I don't know, maybe more than 50% of the difference between different northern dialects.
Hmm.
Although at the same time, in certain areas like Sichuan, which is sort of like down in the west, sort of further south, there are also maybe some differences in vocabulary and pronunciation of specific words. Um, yeah, but my understanding is that the biggest difference is just like the tones are different.
Okay. That's really cool. And I'm taking notes as you're talking because
Mm-hmm.
there's so much that I want to understand.
Oh yeah.
And let me just ask you a general question because I'm noticing as you're talking,
Mm-hmm.
when you sometimes you're saying Chinese and sometimes you're saying Mandarin. And I always feel self-conscious about calling just saying like Chinese because I know that there's so many different dialects that exist in China. What is the right thing to say? Or what's the appropriate thing to say?
Hmm.
Is there
Yeah,
an
that's a good
appropriate
question.
thing to
I feel
say?
like right. I feel like sometimes I don't know. As a native speaker of Mandarin, my habit is just to refer to it all as Chinese, and maybe
Okay.
that's my Mandarin privilege showing or something. Like a native speaker of Cantonese might think differently, but I mean, sometimes it's sort of. I mean, Chinese in my mind is like a broader concept. It's like Mandarin is a subset of Chinese. Like
Mhm.
Chinese includes Cantonese, and I mean just like languages spoken in China, I guess, or even beyond, but by people who like in Singapore and whatever. Yeah, I feel like usually when I talk about like the written language, then saying Chinese is fine because like there's really just one widely accepted written
Mm.
standard. Whereas when you get into sort of the specifics about speaking, then sometimes, yeah, saying Mandarin, like, yeah, I say Mandarin when it's like intended in contrast to some other variety
Right.
of Chinese. Otherwise, like, I sometimes just default to saying Chinese.
Yeah, I was really curious and I think because maybe it's one of those things that I think about because most of the
Mm-hmm.
people that I've known who speak um who are Chinese, I should say,
Mm-hmm.
my Chinese friends,
Yeah.
they all speak Cantonese. So
Right.
it's I never really had any exposure to Mandarin through them, and they were always
Mm-hmm.
really adamant about, no, we speak Cantonese, we're from here, and what the things that our families do are different. So I've kind of picked up a little bit on that, but I just wanted to be clear and to
Yep.
understand, like, not just to
Mm-hmm.
say like, oh, it's just all Chinese and there's a lot there. So I didn't want to put it under one umbrella.
Right. Right.
um
Right.
what about things like, I hate using this word, but for lack of a better word, like slang, or
Mm-hmm.
just kind of the way that I guess younger generations talk. Like, if you know anything about that, what does that sound like? What does that look like? What is it, how do people express themselves colloquially in Mandarin?
Right. I guess I feel like that's probably an area where there's a good amount of regional variety. Like even when speaking Mandarin in Shanghai in school, like when people were just joking around or like speaking less formally, it would be somewhat common to just stick in Shanghainese words in conversation like that. I feel like as far as slang goes, one thing that I've sort of gotten a bit out of touch with regarding that is that I've been back in the States for now 12 years, and a lot of the new internet slang, like just
Mhm.
like new words that are coined to describe new cultural social phenomenon, um, I'm not always entirely sure what they mean sometimes. And so that's an area that's developing pretty quickly. And I guess that's more probably national. It's not as much of a, because it's not restricted by geography of like slang historically would have been.
I'm sure that my listeners know, we're in New York City. New York City has how many Chinatowns do we have? Three? Four? We have three or
I think
four Chinatowns.
a year ago, I saw some like official date in some speech that there were five or like a number larger than I thought was the
Hmm.
case. But yeah, I don't know. There are
Yeah.
three main ones that I can personally think of, but there might be some new ones.
Yeah. And I think that's really amazing that there are so many. There's not just like the
Mm-hmm.
one down in Lower Manhattan, but with all of these Chinatowns comes so many Chinese people from so many different parts of China and
Mm-hmm.
the Chinese diaspora. Are there, so of all like, let's just narrow it down to like Chinatowns, not that, Chinese
Right.
people are not
Mm-hmm.
everywhere, but I guess I wonder, are there places where you're more likely to find people one uh from one region of China? Maybe you'll find restaurants or shops and stuff that specialize in regional cuisine or regional traditions of
Mm-hmm.
one part. And then if you go to a different Chinatown, maybe let's say in Flushing, maybe that's more, I don't know, more
Yeah.
Cantonese,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
like something like is it, do you encounter things like
Yeah,
that? Or
definitely. Yeah,
yeah.
I mean the main. I feel like in my mind, the main distinguishing factor between the three Chinatowns, besides one being in Manhattan, one in Queens, and one in Brooklyn, is that the dialects spoken there are different. Like
Mm,
Lower Manhattan Chinatown, the original Chinatown of New York, it's very heavily, even now, Cantonese speaking. Although I feel like nowadays all like the people who work at restaurants and whatnot have learned Mandarin just for the sake of being able to speak with visitors from the mainland.
mm,
But yeah, historically that's like the Cantonese area, and not just Cantonese. Like even within Cantonese, interestingly, there's like a good amount of dialectal variation, and historically the main dialect of of that Chinatown, and really I think Chinatowns across the U.S. before like 1960 or so, was called Toy Chinese or Hoi Chinese, which is from like basically like a cluster of towns like near Canton, Canton being the capital of Guangdong province.
mm-hmm.
And that dialect is like very different. First of all, the city is called like Taishan in Mandarin, but it's called Hoisan in the like all the T's become H's, and then the D's disappear, and then the Ch's become T's. There's like a whole chain of like sound changes
Mm,
that make that specific dialect quite different from even
okay.
from standard Cantonese. So historically,
Okay.
that was a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in Flushing, which I think is a bit newer, might have started. My understanding is that like before like the 80s or so, there was like a cluster of like Korean migration there, but now it's sort of like as like Chinese immigrants have started to like fill in the area around the Flushing Main Street subway station, you have like a ring of Korean around like the center, which is more. I think Flushing is like the most varied in terms of like where people come from in China. Like they're
Okay.
from all over China. So you have a lot of, I mean, people from Taiwan, also from Shanghai, from various parts of the north. So yeah, that's where I think Mandarin is much more commonly used. And
Oh,
then,
okay.
mhm, yeah, just because it's like more of a mix and more new compared to the historical Chinatown in Manhattan. And then the third one, which I personally have maybe only been to once or twice myself, is in Brooklyn. I forget exactly where, like around Sunset Park, 8th Avenue,
Yeah, yeah.
that area. And that's also quite distinctive. in that most people there speak Fuzhouyi, which is
Oh,
like the dialect of northern Fujian province, which is just like it's like incomprehensible to speakers of any other dialect. Um, it's because like yeah, Fujian province, which is like sort of between Zhejiang, where the Wu dialect and like Shanghainese is spoken, and Guangdong, where Cantonese is spoken. Fujian is like the province that's like right across the strait from Taiwan, and it's
right.
very mountainous. There's like so like every single village has like its own dialect because like there was historically like communication between areas was like a bit restricted. Yeah, like there's a ton of variety in dialects there, and they also split off from like the rest of the Chinese language family like a bit earlier, so it's like
Mm-hmm.
pretty distinctive.
Yeah.
Um, and especially Fuzhou, which is also like in the dialects of like the south of Fujian province are pretty closely related to dialects spoken in Taiwan and in a lot of Southeast Asia, the so-called
Mm-hmm.
Hokkien. Whereas yeah, northern Fujian is like a whole separate language situation. And I've tried to find books to learn the base. It's like impossible to find. Also, there's not really that much resources out there.
Oh
That's like that's
no.
but that's like a huge chunk of sort of yeah Chinese immigration.
I think it's so cool that in New York City we have this kind of like access to so much Chinese culture, so much varied Chinese culture. And I, as a non-Chinese American, I wish I knew more about, and I'm saying this because I'm glad that you're telling me some of the history and some of the
Mm-hmm.
migration patterns and the languages spoken in these different parts, because as a non-Chinese speaker, as a non-Chinese American, like I would have no way of knowing. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's really amazing that you can go someplace like Flushing and you can experience something totally different than if you went all the way down to Brooklyn and
Mm-hmm.
um, experience a culture that is from a completely different region of China. I think that's such a beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm.
um, so let's switch gears for a second. Let's talk about Russian, because you said that you Russian is one of your strongest languages, and you
Mm-hmm.
you studied it for a bit in school. And what was that experience like when you started to learn the Russian language?
Right. I mean, it was a pretty intense language course that we had. An hour a day, 5 days a week, plus an extra hour on Thursdays for like a lecture specifically about grammar for like 2 whole years. So it was like it's like a 5 credit class at, in college. It was like pretty time consuming, but yeah, it was compared to like I think other language classes offered at my school, it was yeah, it's definitely sort of by necessity because of like how complicated the language, the grammar is, that you had to put a bit more
Mhm.
time into it. But yeah, I mean, I had like dabbled in the language a bit before. Like I already knew Cyrillic coming in to the intro class on Russian,
Oh, that's helpful.
and yeah, definitely. And yeah, it was interesting also because like all of our teachers that we had were not like native Russian speakers, which the theory was that it was sometimes helpful for like your teacher to also like know what is actually hard about Russian because they've experienced it themselves. Whereas but
Mm.
a native speaker of Russian in particular oftentimes like has no idea like why you use like genitive case with this number word, but a different case with another number word, or things like that.
Mhm.
At the time, like at one point, my goal was just to like learn like the five, I think, or once I count them on the official working languages of the United Nations. So like I already had English and Chinese down natively, had been dabbling in French and Spanish for a bit. And right, so there were six. The last two were Russian and Arabic. And the Arabic class was already full by the time like I was able to register for classes. So it ended up being Russian.
Okay, so that's pretty intense that you had with your Russian studies. And then you said you went to Russia to study as well?
Yes. So right after 2 years of studying Russian in college, I got this scholarship from the State Department, actually, called they have a program called the Critical Language Scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
They like send students abroad to study various languages that are, on the one hand, considered important for U.S. foreign policy, but on the other hand, like not many people study. So like they had, besides like Russian, they would also send kids to like, well, college students to like Turkey to study Turkish, or even to like Azerbaijan to study Azerbaijani, or like to India to study Hindi and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, me and about 30 other students were sent to a relatively small town in Russia called Ufa, which is the capital of the Republic of Bashkortostan, which is a member of the Russian Federation, but at least in principle, sort of has like a higher level of autonomy than a province does. And still on the European side of Russia, like right by the Ural Mountains, like not too far from Kazakhstan, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think they intentionally just sort of sent us to like sort of off the beaten path places so that we wouldn't just like, I just imagine like if they sent like a bunch of students to just study Russian in Moscow or Petersburg, but people would just find ways to speak English all the time
Right.
in their time off. But yeah, in Ufa, not so much.
So in the time that you were learning Russian here in the States, and then you went to Russia to live, and you were completely immersed in Russian language and in the culture, how how was that experience? Like, did you, because I know that like sometimes we learn in the classroom and then we go on our field trip and we experience the language, and there's so much that we learn that we didn't even know that we didn't know. Were there things in the language and in the culture that once you got there, you're just like, okay, like I really got to catch up, or I have to, you know, figure out what this means? Like, did you have any of those moments?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like, yeah, just some of the things about like how to get around like on a daily basis, like basic things like how much does this cost or like stuff like that. There's like a textbook way to say it, and like a way that people like actually say it in like in a store or something. And yeah, and I mean after just 2 years of Russian, like we hadn't gotten through all of the grammar yet, so like it helped that we had like still had language classes in the mornings to go over some of the things like conjugation, the declension of numbers, and like some finer points like that. And I guess yeah, a bit of slang, which I even now like I've sort of, I guess maybe a couple months ago I've sort of started getting back into like trying to get my Russian to like the next level, like to more advanced level, because like I can read like nonfiction and like the news and whatever, and listen to like talk shows and understand what people are saying, but sometimes like in more informal situations, yeah, there's a good amount of slang that takes a bit of getting used to.
Yeah, yeah. That's really, I think that's really interesting. And I always think about things like that because like for me with French, for example, there are times that, you know, I've studied French here in the US, and then I go to France and I'm just like, what
Oh
are
yeah.
people saying and why are they saying it so quickly? And it's funny, as you mentioned, you know, going to the store and buying things. And I always have a problem with numbers. Like once I
Hmm.
get to a number, like it's weird. I was thinking about this the other day. Like I know the number and how I'm supposed to say the number. And obviously I know what the number looks like. But when
Right.
somebody says it to me and like I have to go pay for something, I'm like, I cannot figure out like what number is this and how much money I'm supposed to give them. It's just like a weird like breakdown that my brain has when like when I hear the number versus um actually seeing the number or someone saying it to me. So I always have like disconnects like that. Um
Right. I think that, yeah, that's a thing that I've heard other people say also, just in terms of language, like numbers for some reason are just a thing that easily trip you. I guess especially like if you're just like learning by like reading, like when you just see a number written, you don't really, your brain I guess doesn't go through the effort of actually like pronouncing it out in the language sometimes, and just sort of like,
yeah.
yeah, I understood that, and then moves along. So yeah, and also like, yeah, some numbers I feel like don't come up that much in, I
Yeah.
don't know, literature or whatever, like
Yeah.
specific numbers. I don't know.
I remember talking about that with Carlos, Dr. Yeba
Hmm.
Lopez, about
Oh
how
yeah.
numbers can just completely trip us up. And for a long time, I thought it was just me, but you know, it
Hmm.
it's not just me. So I feel better about that. I want to know, and you have such an extensive history with so many other languages. Um, Is there anything that maybe in the grammar and the structure of any other languages, related or not related, that helped you to understand the grammar and the structure, or maybe some of the other rules or vocabulary of Russian? Did you have anything to lean on as you were studying the Russian language?
I think for the most part, it's been the other way around. Like once I got Russian out of the way, it helped with uh, plenty of other languages. But I guess one thing is that when I was in high school, like in addition to like learning like real like modern languages that people speak nowadays, I had attempted to learn a bit of Latin and slightly less like ancient Greek on my
Mhm.
own in high school. And I remember just when I was like studying Latin, I was like, wow, no wonder no one speaks this anymore. The grammar is too complicated. how, how do you have six cases in a language and expect people to just be able to have like day to day casual conversation? But then I started learning Russian. I was like, wow, people still speak language that are this complicated to this day. So I
Right.
guess on that level, just having like dabbled even a little bit in like Latin or whatever helps, just in terms of like the concepts of like what is going on with like the dative case or the instrumental case in Russian. Yeah, but I guess, yeah, like I said, for the most part, I feel like having done Russian earlier has helped a lot more with other languages.
That's good to know. It's funny as you're saying like Latin has 6 cases, I'm like Hungarians like hold my beer because
Right. Yeah. Although I feel like really Hungarian cases, I've studied like Hungarian a couple of times. I've been to like Budapest like twice, and like every time I'm always like, great, I have an excuse to actually study some, because like usually like Hungarian doesn't really seem worth the time to study, but if I'm like, oh, I'm going to be in Budapest in a month, then I have an excuse to dabble in some Hungarian, and it's always like, yeah, I think it's the cases in Hungarian or like in Turkish or something. In some ways, aren't that bad. I don't know. I feel like they're just like there's like prepositions basically. Like you just
Mm,
tag something on at the end of a word and maybe change it based on vowel harmony
yeah.
or something. But yeah, with yeah, I guess it's just a bit different. Yeah, and in Russian, it's also like this, there's a lot of irregular nouns that when the case changes, like sometimes you add an ah, sometimes it's an oo,
Mhm.
sometimes the stress jumps from the beginning to the end of the word, but
Mhm.
another word that's shaped like has the same general shape doesn't have the stress shift, and it's just
Right.
like a lot of exceptions you need to learn
Yeah.
also.
And I also imagine, you tell me, but I imagine that in a language that has so many cases that there are probably some that are used more frequently than others, and maybe others that are maybe only used in maybe literature or written or formal text. Is that true?
I'd say for Russian, not really. Even like what I guess would be like the rarest case, like instrumental, is still like used pretty frequently when you're just describing what you're like. I'm drinking with a spoon, or like I am, or this was done by someone. That's also instrumental,
Hmm.
or like even like just for the verb to be. Sometimes like the thing that you're being, that you are, is an instrumental case. And so yeah, I feel like, yeah, with something like Hungarian or Finnish or something, I feel like, yeah, when you go down the list of like 20 some cases, like some of the lower ones seem like they don't get used that often. But
Hmm.
with Russian, I feel like, yeah, the sixth case is sort of, I mean, of course, like nominative for the subject and accusative for the object get used a lot more.
Right.
But yeah, even like the rarer ones, like prepositional and instrumental, get used a bunch. I guess specific combinations of like a word and a case, and like you have to know like when the stress shifts or not. Sometimes, yeah, individual, yeah, words like that can be rare sometimes.
So with all of the languages that you speak, that you've dabbled in, that you've um, you know, a few words here and there and everything in between, what are some things that have helped you to find success in some of the languages that you've gained fluency in?
I guess when I think about the languages that I actually speak like well, like I'm able to like have like normal conversations on various topics, and I think the real difference has just been the ones that I actually have an opportunity to speak. So like Spanish and French. And I mean, I have a good amount of friends who like studied German also and stuff like that. So that's probably, whereas like others, like I've like studied like Indonesian or Swahili or various like that's just, there's not many speakers of those languages in New York City. At least they're a bit harder to find at the very least. So
Mhm.
those end up being like, wow, I'm really interested in this language, but then it's just sort of like finding opportunities to practice.
Yeah.
So I feel like, yeah, it's also just like a lot of times it just ends up coming down to like the amount of resources for studying these languages. Like I started around the same time about 2 years ago trying to start learning Korean, and shortly after I started also like trying to dabble a bit in Vietnamese. And
Mm.
now like 2 years down the line, like I'm like conversational in Korean and far from conversational in Vietnamese, just because there's so much.
Really?
This is just so much more material there. Like on Netflix, there's like endless like Korean shows that you can watch with like Korean and English
That's
subtitles, and
true.
just like
Yeah.
just the amount of exposure you can get, and also just like textbooks. Also, they cover like beginner level, intermediate. There's like with a lot of languages like I've dabbled in, the problem has been like you can finish like the intro textbook, but then there's still like a gap between the end of that textbook and the beginning of being able to actually talk to people. And
Right.
there's just like not much out there to fill that gap with some less common languages.
Mhm.
So really, yeah, it just comes down to like tons and tons of exposure that ends up being like the key.
Mhm. Yeah, I noticed that too, like with Vietnamese, and I've heard people say before, like it's difficult to it might be somewhat easy to find like very beginner material, but
Mm-hmm.
then after that, the more advanced intermediate stuff is either hard to find or the quality is kind of sketchy. So
Mm-hmm.
it can be hard for people, I guess, to advance in that. What are some things about Mandarin and Russian and the languages that you would want people to know that you what are some things that you would want people to know that they may not necessarily be aware of?
Yeah, for Russian, I feel like, I don't know, there's been so many times I run into people who are like, oh wow, you learned Russian. That must be so hard. Just looking at the alphabet, it looks hard. And I'm like, yeah, like the writing of Russian is like far from, it's like, I made a list of things that are hard about Russian, like the alphabet. I don't know if it would be the top 10 even. It's just, it's like, I mean, half the letters are like, it's like about as hard as, I don't know, the Greek alphabet. Like it has a
Mm,
pi, it has like a row, it has like, it's like a third of the letters are the same as English letters.
mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, just sort of the grammar of Russian. But besides the cases, also like the whole verb system is quite different from how like the verb system of Slavic languages in general is like pretty interesting and different from how like Western European languages work. It's not. It's like
Yeah.
instead of tenses, it's like sort of centered around a concept of aspect, like whether or not this action is in progress or completed. I guess it's a bit contemporary, kind of like imperfect versus simple past in
Mm-hmm.
some Western European languages, but it's sort of like the way like you have like for every verb you have to learn two verbs. Like one, like they're usually related in some way, but it's not like there's not a single rule. Like you add a prefix, but it's like a different prefix for each verb that you just
Right.
have to remember, like two forms of each verb.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of interesting. Yeah, I guess an interesting thing about Mandarin, I think of it, that's sort of part of the reason, I guess, why Mandarin is the way it is, like sort of like phonologically simpler, has fewer tones, dropped off a lot of the ending sounds.
Mm-hmm.
A theory that I hear gets thrown out a lot is just that it's sort of like because of the influence from the north of like the Mongols and then the Manchus later, just sort of like a lot of like cultural mixing with like non-Chinese groups coming in from the north who for like extensive periods of time also ruled over like basically all of China. That sort of like contributed to sort of like the more dramatic language like
Mm-hmm.
language change in Mandarin compared to other, because it's sort of also because it was like used of a language of like international inter-ethnic communication sort of contributed to it being a bit more simplified than some of the
Yeah.
southern dialects. But at the same time, it's also like yeah, the languages like Manchu or Mongolian or Korean or like like languages on the north side of China grammatically are like very different from Chinese. They're
Mm-hmm.
like whereas like on the south side of Chinese, you've got like Vietnamese and Thai, and those are all kind of like I mean even though they're not really related at all, just like the way things work, like single syllable words with tones
Mm-hmm.
and just like they're just like more like Chinese. No, so which makes it sort of a interesting like
Yeah.
the environment of like language contact in the
Right.
south and the north is quite different.
Yeah. Kevin, thank you so much for having this conversation with me and for talking so much about your languages. Um, I like to end each episode on the same
Mm-hmm.
question, and that
Oh
is
yeah.
that is, do you have any jokes, tongue twisters, cool slang words, idioms, words of wisdom, or words of advice in Mandarin or in Russian to share?
Yes, I actually prepared something for both. Um, the Chinese one we were talking about earlier about how Mandarin is sort of like phonetically simplified and like not as complicated as other Chinese dialects. A good example of that, and it's this poem, this Chinese, well, not really a poem, it's more of a like a prose text actually written in classical Chinese, where every single word in this poem, which is it looks like it's maybe 50 characters long, is
Mm-hmm.
shi, but with different tones. So shi or shi or shi or shi. And like the story is about a poet by the surname Shi who likes eating lions and goes to the market to buy 10 lions. Anyways, I'll send you a link. It's the English name of the poem is grotto poet, like a
Mm.
poet living in a grotto of stone. Anyways,
Oh.
just so you hear what it sounds like,
Mm-hmm.
it's wow. 时是诗是诗是是诗是时时 Okay, I don't feel like doing this whole thing, but that's the general vibe of this poem. And it's just like part of it's just like, it's not just a question of like, wow, tones change the meaning of things, because also like some of these characters, like they're different characters, but they're just pronounced the same and have the same tone. So it's like also like shows sort of the importance of like the characters, like seeing something written sometimes like is needed to actually. But also, I think another point of this poem is why people don't use classical Chinese anymore, because this is an even bigger problem in the classical language, I feel like, than it is like in modern written Mandarin.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't ever write something like this, because the sentences would just be like a bit longer and more, it would be clearer what things meant.
Yeah.
But yeah.
What year is that poem from?
It's pretty new. Well, as far as Chinese history goes, it was written in the 1930s, like by a linguist who was just trying to like demonstrate some of the challenges of like trying to like, when people were debating whether they should simplify Chinese characters or just switch to like a Latin-based script, or like whether they should continue using classical or move like so I mean, yeah, an example like this illustrates a lot of the problems, because also like these words that all are pronounced like shi or shi or shi or shi in Mandarin, half of them are pronounced differently in like Cantonese or in any other Chinese dialect. So it's just like they all merged into like one sound.
Right.
In Mandarin.
Okay.
As far as Russian goes, I thought of a funny one, which is a few minced oaths. I think that's the technical term. Like when you want to say a swear word, but you don't want to say the swear word. Like in English, when you say like fudge or shoot or something. Those are funny in Russian because, I mean, first of all, in Russian, it's like the attitude, at least officially, towards profanity is much stricter, I feel like, than in the United States, at least, where like in movies, I think, or like it's like illegal to use actual swear words in movies at all. But anyways, it's funny that the words they came up with to replace the swear words, one of them means pancake, and it's just blin, B-L-I-N.
Blin.
And that's like, yeah. And it literally just means pancake, but it's like it's a replacement for a different Russian word that means something a bit more profane. And then there's also the word hien, which means horseradish, literally.
Hien.
But it's also a euphemism for a swear word in Russian. And yeah, I thought those were just like funny as examples of how they just found these words that, oh, this sounds, I'm hinting at a swear word here, but I'm just going to say pancake or horseradish instead.
That's so cool. I never really think of things like that, because I think a lot of us just go straight to the swear words and what some of the most like vile insults are. But I think we forget that, you know, in places of decorum, that people do use euphemisms, or they use other words instead of these horrific insults. So that's funny. That's really funny. Pancake. I think.
And I mean, another thing about just the system of swear words in Russian is that they like, because in Russian you can derive verbs from nouns by adding all sorts of different prefixes and like different, so like there can be like dozens and dozens of like swear words sharing like the same root. And like one can mean like awesome and one can mean like terrible, just depending on like what like prefix or suffix you add onto it. It's like quite elaborate, but also it's quite hard to find materials. Like I found this book of like Russian swear words a few months ago, and like the preamble to this book was like the author apologizing, saying the intent of this publication is not to debase or something on those lines.
Yeah.
Debase the culture, but rather to provide additional insight into the roots of the Russian. It was like they had to like apologize for writing like a swear word, a dictionary of swear words.
How polite. Oh, that's really funny. Well, Kevin, thank you again for this conversation. And I learned so much. I took so many notes, and I have a lot of more reading to do after this. Thank you again for talking
Yeah,
with me
thanks for
about your
having me.
languages. Really quickly before I let you go, don't think
Hmm.
about this too hard, but in this situation where we've been talking for some time and it's time to part ways, what would be the
Hmm.
best way to say goodbye in any of your languages? Just the first thing that
Hmm.
comes to mind.
Well, Russian, the usual Russian way of saying goodbye is interesting, sort of, for the literal meaning. They just say "пока," which means, well, it literally just means for now, I guess, or yeah, sort of like a,
Paka?
yeah, "poka" with stress.
Poka.
Hmm. But
Okay.
when O isn't stressed, it's pronounced as an A also, so it's basically "пока."
Okay. Paka,
But
Kevin,
hmm
thank you. Thank you again. And I'll be talking to you soon.
yep. All right, sounds
Bye.
good. Thanks. Bye.